And hopefully that notification will pop up in a second. All right, everyone. Welcome to DBA Fundamentals Virtual Group. For our topic today on Azure SQL Year in Review, speakers Bob Ward and Anna Hoffman. Just a quick introductory announcement, just to get the usual pieces of business out of the way. We have our three leaders, Steve Cantrell, myself, and Kevin Wilkie on the top right. There's our Twitter handles beside our names. If at any stage you want to get in touch with us, we have multiple ways to do that. We have Slack, we have Twitter, but if you contact us directly by Twitter handles, probably be the most efficient way to get in touch with us. We have a couple of different URLs as well that you can reach out to. We've got the meetup.com DBA Fundamentals group. We've got dbafund.org, our website. All our recordings, as much as we can, are up on dbafundtube.com. And we encourage you to reach out to the SQL community Slack and LinkedIn groups as well. Before anyone gets concerned about having to drop off from meetings and stuff, we know this is around your lunchtime. We try and get as many sessions as we can recorded and up on dbafundtube.com, and we'll release a quick little blurb on Twitter or Slack when this is available. I'm going to give a very, very quick overview of the two speakers because I believe everyone has at least heard of them or encountered them sometime in their database career. Bob Ward, Principal Architect, Microsoft Azure Data Team. If you have been lucky enough to visit any of his talks before, I'm sure you've had your brain melted once or twice. And Anna Hoffman, Data and Applied Scientist in the SQL Engineering Team, really enjoying her Data Exposed talks coming out.
Stuff like that. So I mean,
and with that, I will hand it over.
Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. We are super excited to be here. This is at least this is my first user group of the year. Bob, is this your first?
Yes.
So it's exciting to kick off the year with a session like this. And it's actually been a while since I've done a user group. Bob, I turned my camera on, but I realized I didn't ask you if you were going to turn yours on.
Yeah, I'm going to go cameraless today. Is that a term? Cameraless? Is that a thing? Yeah.
It keeps the mystery going.
That's it. I just want people to have the mystery of what I might be looking like, right? I think probably a lot of Cowboys jerseys, Cowboys paraphernalia, things like that, probably. So
not like
get ready for the playoffs.
Yeah. Okay, I'll turn off my camera too, just for consistency.
Go Cowboys.
So we're excited. We're going to be talking about the year in review for Azure SQL. We'll actually cover even things like SQL Server and Azure Arc in this space. So I will be interested to hear some of the topics for today. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We will be taking a look at that as we go. So we'll try to answer questions as we go. This is a pretty informal session. We just want to make sure you have all the latest and greatest updates that happened last year, so you're ready for this year. Anything else, Bob, you want to add before we get started?
No, I'm excited to be here. I was actually in this group in December talking about SQL Server 2022, and we'll briefly mention that towards the end. But I love this, Anna, because it's a really good way for people to get a summary of all the great stuff we've done in Azure SQL over the whole past year. Allows folks to try to figure out and pick and choose where should they go focus in 2022 on all the great stuff we've done. So yeah, this ought to be a great update.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, let's get right into it. Before we actually get into the product updates, please bear with me because I want to just cover at a high level. When we say Azure SQL, what do we mean by that? And I know probably many of you have heard this spiel before, so bear with me and we'll get into some updates. But I think it's important to call out when we say Azure SQL, we're not just talking about one thing. We're talking about 3 different deployment options for running kind of the SQL Server engine in the cloud. The first one is going to be SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. So this is exactly what it sounds like. You pick the version of SQL Server, you pick the OS and the version there, and you just get a SQL Server. You get all the features and capabilities that you expect in a given SQL Server version, plus some added benefits that we can add around like automatic security updates. We can help you with things like automatic backups, and we can help with some other things that we'll talk about actually today, because there's been a lot of updates in this space over the past year. This is something you'll hear us refer to as infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. Now, remember, with this option, you're still responsible for things like updates and patching, apart from some of those critical security updates. Now, if we say, hey, you know, I don't need a whole SQL Server, but I do want to take advantage of some of the PaaS, or platform as a service, capabilities that the cloud has to offer, then Azure SQL Managed Instance is kind of one layer higher than this. So with Azure SQL Managed Instance, you're not going to get access to the OS, but you're essentially going to get a managed SQL Server. So all those instance scope capabilities you're still going to have access to. So things like Service Broker, Database Mail, DTC, SQL Server Agent, Machine Learning Services, etc. These are what we refer to as instance scope capabilities, and they are all available for the most part in Azure SQL Managed Instance. Bob and I also refer to this as the best of SQL Server with the best of a managed service. So we're going to talk about that as well. And this is versionless. So as we apply new updates, you just get those. And you don't have to worry about upgrading or testing or anything like that. Now, if you go one level higher than that and say, hey, I don't need those instance scope capabilities, but I want to take advantage of some of the latest and greatest capabilities that Azure SQL has to offer, then we have Azure SQL Database. And this is just a database, but in this offering, we have options like hyperscale, where you can scale up to 100 terabytes and then even bigger in theory, as well as serverless, where you can get things like auto scaling and auto pause and resume. So in this session, we're going to start by talking about the updates in the Azure SQL space, and then I mentioned we'll also give some bonus updates around Azure Arc migration and SQL Server. So let's get right into it by starting with SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. Now, there's quite a few updates that have happened in the past year. So again, we're going to look at everything from January through December of 2021. So you'll see a lot of updates depending on the service. I think we're going to talk about most of these in the coming slides. The one I wanted to highlight here is AD util. If you're using Linux, this is a cool tool for AD authentication that you might want to check out. But here I'll pass to Bob to talk a little more about those SQL VM updates.
Thanks, Hannah. You know, for SQL Server and Azure Virtual Machine, it is just the complete SQL Server package, right? It's the complete box that you get in a VM. So you have complete control of what's going inside the guest OS, updating the OS. But what we're trying to do here, and you see by these bullet points, and let's kind of go to the next slide to talk more about sizing. What we're trying to do is try to give you a couple of things. Number one, what's the best advice we can give you on how to get the best performance for SQL Server in the Azure infrastructure? And then what kind of assistance along the way, almost kind of like a managed experience, can we give you to help you in your deployment? So look at this slide right here. A friend of ours, a colleague of Ann and ours, Pam LaHood, aka @SQL Goddess, runs this space for us now for Azure VM. And it's a great thing for all of us, because not only is she super smart, but she knows SQL very well. And she understands that getting the maximum performance for SQL in a VM environment is really critical to your success. So we have been recommending, if you look at this diagram right here, the E series with either, you know, if you can see the range of the numbers here, 64 and 32 represent number of cores possible in these VM sizes. So in the VM space, when you pick a size, you're picking, how many cores do I get? Do I get local storage? That's what the D stands for, by the way. Do I get premium storage possible? That's what the S stands for. And then we have these generations of these sizes. This is all based on what's hardware going on behind the scenes. And so this V4 E series is something we've recommended. And quite frankly, Pam has called that, you know, sprinkles, like Pam's recommendation, like a Yelp recommendation, right? And you can see on here the configuration of storage, the compute cost. It's all been about getting you the right core memory ratios with I/O performance for these sizes. So what we've announced is a new generation of these E series, because what we've recognized is that you probably want Sorry, there I get a little bit of a feedback from somebody. What you probably want is you probably want the best performance you can get with that core ratio, but you don't want to pay 64 cores to get IO performance when you may only need 32. So that's what the double sprinkles VM recommendation means, is that we're giving you now a better price performance ratio with having to use less cores. And that's what the E32B, the B stands for getting this new IO throughput ratio for the same core count. So again, the whole concept being is that we want to give you recommendations on the right sizes to get the maximum performance for SQL, for getting the right memory ratios, but also giving you the best price performance. And so this new series is now available in preview, and the link below Anna has here is a way to sign up for that. And if you go out there and look and do searching, you can go to Data Exposed, for example, and find episodes with Pam talking with Anna about her recommendations for sizing, and she's got links there where you can look at to see, like, what are all my different recommendations for you. Now, not just sizing, what are the things can we provide you to assist you with getting that best performance and best experience? So Ibra Esson, another colleague in our team, has spent a lot of time in the space of doing assessments, best practices. So what we've done is, in the portal itself, you can go enable this idea of doing SQL assessments with your SQL VM recommendations or your SQL VM deployment. And then if you run this, we'll scan your configuration of your SQL Server, of your VM configuration, everything you've done, to see, are you getting the best experience? Are you doing the right best practices we think you should do? Let me give an example. If I light this up today in my Azure VM, I will be able to see the fact that maybe I don't have locked pages on, because that still matters running it even inside these Azure VM environments. So great rule set of things that we've published on GitHub that you can now go in and configure to run in your workloads and get these recommendations. So that's one great area that we've invested in. If you've ever heard of Microsoft Defender, we now have branded that. It used to be called Azure Defender. We've branded that as Microsoft Defender for the cloud, and Microsoft Defender for SQL is a specific one for Azure VM for SQL. And so in the portal now, in this blade, you can look at Defender, and then now you're going to get recommendations on security things, whether it's vulnerability assessments or even like things like SQL injection attacks for advanced threat protection. So both of these combined are kind of giving you a best practice and a proactive way to make sure you've configured for the best experience and that you're looking at things from a security perspective. And the great thing about these technologies is, since they're in the cloud, we can keep these up to date and fresh for you without you having to do reinstallations of anything. You've just got SQL Server and VM deployed, and then now these things will automatically scan for you and then be updated for all your needs. We also know that when you deploy SQL Server in a VM with something called a marketplace image, which is like a pre-installed version of SQL and a combination of a SQL version and an Azure, like a operating version, that we just pre-install everything for you. But we know also, though, when you install SQL Server yourself, you make choices for the configuration of SQL based on your needs. Like, look at this top thing here. You pick correlations, you pick certain SQL config options. You even want us to give you some recommendations as you go do that for things like max DOP or memory, or ensure instant finalization is actually enabled. So now, in the past, you didn't get these choices. So now when you go through and install SQL or deploy it using the portal with marketplace images, we've got new, you can see it today yourself. You can go into the portal and see these new experiences where you choose these options versus having to configure them later. And the same thing applies for being able to do things like this. You know, can we give you options of where do the binaries go? Can you install the client tools at the same time you deploy SQL? Getting rid of some obsolete trace flags that we had in the experience. So on our roadmap is not just number 1, but number 2 and number 3, just continue to make the experience even better for you if you install SQL in this pre-deployed fashion. And there's more, because we know that there are other best practices you're looking at. So for example, can we go through and give you warnings if you pick certain storage options, which again, you're picking your storage options as you go through this. Can we warn you that maybe choices you're going to make could lead to a not great experience down the road? And we'll even do things like TempDB best practices, a big thing for you, right? So maybe if we give you these choices in the portal, we can give you some warnings about the choices you may make may lead again to like a bad performance experience because it's not aligned with the practices that we would recommend. So again, the overall picture is, optimize while you deploy, right? And we're going to give you these experiences to the portal itself as you go through. Another piece of the puzzle might be the fact that you want to do high availability in Azure VM. And if you didn't know this or not, you can do it. You can do an availability group. You can do a failover cluster. The problem is that in the past, we were recommending options, or you would go into options where you needed something called an Azure load balancer. And that created a lot of complexities for customers, including actually, causing some delays sometimes in failover time. Well, SQL Server's always been able to support multi-subnets for these failover clusters and availability groups. So now we just lit that up. You can see we have a blog where you can go through and take a look at. If you just look for multi-subnet configuration, SQL Server and Azure, we have the ability now for you to set up these multi-subnets. And it's not as difficult as you might think to go set this up. But when you do this, you get great benefits out of this. It makes it a much more easier configuration, a much more seamless way of doing it without an Azure load balancer. You still get the listener concept. You still get all those kind of concepts, but it's just a way to make things look a little easier for you and better for you, just like if you were doing this on premises. So this is kind of just a few of the things we're doing to make the complete SQL Server and Azure VM experience better for you, and take advantage of some of the best practices and things we know based on our experience with our customers.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, there's definitely a lot in there, and I think you'll just continue to see these improvements to make this experience better for folks running SQL Server and Azure virtual machines. So moving down the line of Azure SQL options, the next is Azure SQL Managed Instance. So again, this is like a managed SQL Server. So you're going to get instance scoped capabilities, and what you're going to find is our managed instance team is always working on a ton of updates. So I think the number that they had for the year was over 25 updates across public preview and general availability. So you can see some things in here. Just to call out a few that were big earlier in the year, things like long-term retention. So this is the ability to keep your backups up to 10 years. Things like maintenance windows. This is coming to Azure SQL Database as well, but this is allowing you to essentially select when any maintenance or updates is going to be performed on your databases and servers. So if you want to pick a time of low usage for your workloads, whether that's on the weekends at night or weekdays at night, or a couple other options that they have for you, that's available. Some other things you'll see, like granular permissions for dynamic data masking. This is something that was asked a lot by customers to have more granularity in how this is done. So that's what you can find there. And pretty much all the things on here, we've done some form or fashion of data exposed episodes on. So we'll share some links at the end if you want to go deeper into any of these things. The other one I wanted to call out for you SQL Server folks is Scalar UDF inlining. Now, this is something that came to SQL Server 2019, and it's one of the few things, usually we say cloud first. This is one of the few things that landed in SQL Server 2019 and took us a while to get right in Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance, but that became available kind of late in 2021. And then for some of the rest of the ones here, we're going to go into a little bit more detail. And I see a question about the slides. We can definitely share the slides with Shane and get them shared out to you in some way. But yeah, now we're going to go into a little bit detail of some of the main themes that we've been investing in this space. And one of those is hybrid flexibility.
Yeah, Anna, I remember this conversation happening on our team actually early in 2021, was the fact that we're not taking advantage of the assets we already have for SQL Server customers and for customers that like Azure SQL Managed Instance, which again is still platforms as service. So one of the things we thought about very early on is that could we take a SQL Server, could we connect it to Managed Instance and allow you to do something in a very easy way to migrate to the cloud? So we call this thing link feature for Azure SQL Managed Instance. So here's the thinking. You're running on SQL Server 2019. As it turns out, we just announced this like last year, right? So believe me, I think it's going to be even older versions, supported versions, they're going to support this. But here's the idea. We have this technology already called availability groups in SQL Server built into the engine itself. We don't need anything else besides the engine to do that, to actually just set up an availability group. Yeah, auto failover requires things like clustering, but just doing an availability group and replicas is built into the engine. So we thought, okay, there's this concept called the distributed availability group already. It's pretty hard to set up, but it allows you to do like a DR site using AGs, like multiple AGs on AGs. So we thought to ourselves, okay, managed instance is the SQL Server engine. Could we actually set up for a customer very easily if they choose to? You just tell us the managed instance you want to deploy. You've already got deployed. Take your SQL Server. You can just attach it. You tell us which one to attach to. We'll seed your database. We'll set up a DAG behind the scenes for you, and then we'll start feeding changes into the managed instance. And so while this change process is going on, you could go in the managed instance now because the database is read-only, and then you could do read-only workloads through Synapse, ML, whatever you wanted to do. You could read-only workloads for your app while your primary workload is still in SQL Server. And that could be on premises or even other cloud systems as well. So when you're ready here, and you're like, you know what, I want to migrate to managed instance. Today, you can do online migration with log shipping technologies, but let's do it even more zero downtime scenarios. So now all of a sudden you could say, look, I'd like to migrate now to that MI. You can do a cutover, migrated MI. We'll take that database, now make it read-write, and now you're fully into the cloud. And so this is a big scenario for us, is we're unlocking you with the ability to migrate when you want to, but in the meantime, before you've done it, use MI as a read-only scenario. Pretty cool, pretty exciting. A lot of customers have wanted to take a look at that. Now, because of this technology, though, there's something interesting, though, in SQL 2022 we announced. And that is, because we can do this behind the scenes, what if for SQL Server 2022, we could make that MI a DR site for you? And even set up in such a way where this could even be a fail back scenario. So we'll talk about a little bit later today when we mentioned about SQL Server 2022, but this is one of the big things that we're going to be promoting with that latest release of SQL Server is same type of scenario as the previous slide, but instead of it being a migration play, it'll be more of a DR play for you. So that's pretty exciting stuff. And it's just a way what we're trying to do is take advantage of two things: platform as a service in the cloud for you, and the fact that we have built-in technologies with availability group and DAGs built into the engine to kind of connect these systems together.
Yeah, this is certainly super cool technology, and Bob and I both have been demoing this a lot. So if you check the resources at the end, we'll be able to find you some videos if you want to see this in action. One of the other themes that we've been working on in a team is listening to you all's feedback saying, hey, we need more storage for our SQL managed instances, and we need more memory. So the next kind of theme of updates is around larger instances. So some of the things we announced last year, this was near the end of the year, I think in November, we announced the general availability of 16 terabyte support for SQL managed instance general purpose. So this is a 2x increase, as you can see there. And there are other things that came with this. So when we announced the public preview for this for general purpose, of course, the next question was, when is it coming for business critical? So also in November, after announcing the GA for general purpose, we announced the public preview for 16 terabyte support for business critical. And this was even, potentially even a bigger of an increase because before this, the maximum size you can have was only 4 terabytes. So you're getting kind of a 4x increase here. And this is in a limited number of regions. It's noted there. That's just as we roll this out and do the testing. But if it's needed for you, then you can always escalate through the portal. But expect that we'll be working on building this out as we can. Now, that's just from a storage perspective or size perspective. But in order to do this, we have some new hardware generation. So let's look at CPUs first. So today, if you went, or before this update, if you would go into the portal, you'd see Gen 5. And you always see we name our hardware kind of interesting. And the idea is that we're always going to be updating this to give you the latest and greatest hardware at the best kind of price perk that we can give. Now, this is when we announced the premium series, and you can see some of the stats there, but from the Azure Compute numbers, we found that this can achieve up to 15% better performance for a lot of different workloads. And again, we also have some demos here if you want to kind of see these side by side. Now, from a memory perspective as well, if you look at what the standard series or the Gen 5 series, now we're calling it the standard series, afforded was about 5.1 gigs of memory per vCore. So what we saw in this scenario was a lot of customers needed to over provision their vCores. So they didn't necessarily need all those cores, but in order to get more memory, they had to scale up. And this was inflating the cost for our customer. And for some of our customers, especially those high memory type of workloads, even the max amount of memory wasn't enough for some of these larger applications. So within the premium series, there are two options, right? So you can pick the generic premium series. This is going to give you 7 gigs of memory per vCore. So this is going to be more than the standard, almost about 50% more. And if you really need it, we have this new series called the Memory Optimized Premium Series. And this is going to give you almost 3x what you were getting in the Gen 5 standard series, or a max of 870 gigabytes per instance. So this was a big win. I think a lot of customers are excited about this from the combination of not only just the size, but also the memory that's going to be afforded. So that's the large instances.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited to see how that plays out. I've been already starting to deploy those series and seeing a big boost in performance for my apps that I've been using on MI, especially just getting a lot more memory. Using things like in-memory LTP now also expand because part of the memory that you use for that is part of that. And then you get these new, the ability to do like bigger standard storage sizes and BC tiers, which is really a big thing as well. So for managed instance, one of the things we got feedback from customers is about security, and a little bit have to do with the fact about authentication and the fact that I still kind of feel like old school SQL password stuff, when I'm using managed instance. So one of the goals the team has is how much can we make this a passwordless system? And it involves several things that we've invested in. Number one, and we're going to show you in a few slides here in a second, can we provide a true, almost a Windows authentication experience like you have in SQL Server today? Can you get that thing in managed instance? Do you have the ability to only allow Azure AD? In other words, today with managed instance, you can support having a SQL admin with a password and an Azure AD admin without a password, right? Well, can you maybe set it up so I'm not even going to allow? This is kind of, think of this like in SQL Server where you don't have mixed mode scenario. So don't allow mixed mode. That's kind of what the goal is. And then things like link servers. We did not support Azure AD auth for link server connections. You still had to use like a SQL auth scenario. So that's supported now. And then if you've not seen this concept of a managed identities, it's the concept of having almost like security without a user. So user managed identities just mean that you can build your own managed identity in Azure, and you can assign this to a managed instance and use it for these scenarios like backups or using Open Rosette to avoid things like, using these passwords and certificates. So again, managed identity, a really cool concept in the cloud that applies to a lot of different Azure scenarios. We want that to be part of managed instance. And then, finally, what we realize is that we have endpoints we use for things like backups and various things, and we want people to put policies in place to help restrict access to what those things look like, things that might be outside the virtual cluster in managed instance. So all of these together provide some really great innovations in the security space. It's all about trying to make you more secure, provide less, more granular access, and again, try to go to this concept of a passwordless system. So let's talk a little bit about this Windows auth concept. So this concept today already. You use SQL Server and pick integrated security, and you go in and put your domain account in, log into SQL, and there was never a password you supplied to SQL. So up to this point, we've only allowed Azure Active Directory authentication, which means your app would have to do that. So what if you could go in and take an app you've built that uses your own domain account, right? Connect to managed instance and do that by tying in the worlds of your Active Directory with Azure Active Directory. In other words, you could take an Azure Active Directory account that you would build, map it to your local Active Directory account, your domain account, just map that together, but your app wouldn't change. So let's look at that from kind of a flow perspective. Like, what does that look like, from a Kerberos kind of perspective? So you got a client app, and you're going to log in with your normal domain account, but you've already mapped your like AAD account, like you see at the bottom down here, this AAD type syntax. You've separately mapped that to your domain account. So when the app now sends an authentication request, we'll use Kerberos tickets, and we're going to actually have these tickets exchanged with Azure Active Directory behind the scenes. But here's the cool thing, the app doesn't change. And this is a huge request from our customers. I want to get non-SQL authentication with managed instance like I do with SQL Server today, but I don't have to log in with an Azure AD account. My app doesn't use that. It just uses integrated security with domain accounts. And so we're providing that now behind the scenes. Yeah, you have to set up the trust between your AD and your Azure AD. We have documentation exactly how to do that. And that support's been there in the Azure world. But now you have this really nice seamless experience where we're going to use Kerberos, allow your app not to change, take the power of Azure AD and combine it with your current AD scenario and give you that really nice Kerberos feeling. So this is a game changer for us. This got announced for preview in November. Huge interest we've seen from customers wanting to go down this path, because now when they're migrating from SQL Server to Azure MI, it's just one other thing now that doesn't have to change from the app perspective to give that nice secure experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, Bob, across the board, like managed instance is really coming out with a lot of updates. I know we'll talk a little bit about the future, but is there anything we can share about what's coming in this space?
In this year?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's several things we're doing. One thing we're trying to do is it is a SQL server, right? It's platform as a service, but it's a SQL server. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to give you more of that SQL server experience. For example, today, TempDB is very managed for you. And that's great, except for there's some scenarios where customers want that still customized experience. Like, go ahead and create a default number of TempDB files for me, but let me customize the number of files, because you can't do that today. That's just an example of just trying to take things like that customers experience today that are like SQL Server and still have access to that. Another huge area you can look forward to us working on, nothing to really announce today, is the deployment experience. So when you deploy today or you scale in MI, because we're using this virtual cluster concept, the time it takes to do that is significantly longer than, say, like an Azure database. So we're really trying to make that experience, quite frankly, very reasonable, very fast, very manageable for someone, whether they deploy or scale. Look for that one to be something that we're certainly looking at as we move here into the calendar year. Again, nothing to announce that we're ready to launch it or ready to do it, but that's something we're certainly taking a look at.
Thanks. Yeah, I love to put Bob on the spot in public forums and try to get him to announce something.
Yeah, that doesn't really happen, does it? Yeah, good try. It's a good try.
Okay, so we talked about SQL Server on Azure VMs. We talked about Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now let's move on and talk about Azure SQL Database before we switch to some cross Azure SQL, some migration, Azure Arc SQL Server. Still a lot to cover here. In the Azure SQL Database space, we launched a lot of things in the past year. Again, some of these things you'll see overlap with Azure SQL Managed Instance as we can, if it makes sense. When we do new things in our platform as a service offerings, we're going to try to do them across. Now, this won't happen all the time, but you'll see with things like scalar UDF inlining, some of these new T-SQL functions, maintenance windows, we're going to be, and Azure Active Directory only off, we're going to be working to kind of bring parity as it makes sense. Not everything, but as it makes sense. Now, some of the biggest announcements to me in the Azure SQL Database space were back in May, we announced SQL Ledger support for Azure SQL Database. And essentially, this is bringing the power of blockchain out of a decentralized type of environment, but into Azure SQL Database. So for no extra cost, for no extra really effort, you can just create these ledger tables. We have lots of information. We did a deep dive on this as well with the leader on this product. But you know, this really opens a lot of scenarios. We've seen a lot of adoptions from a lot of different types of companies. So that's a really exciting one. And we'll also share in SQL Server, again, how this is also coming into the picture in future versions, but I won't ruin that. We announced some things in public preview earlier in the year, like query store hints. And again, this is another example of how we're working on things to come first to Azure SQL Database or the cloud as we can, and then bring them into our future box products. We also, let's see, what else is interesting here? We announced a couple new Microsoft Learning Paths and learning modules. These are two in the Azure SQL Database space, two around building full stack apps. So if you're interested in getting started with things like Azure Functions, Azure Static Web Apps, GitHub Actions, and how it all relates to SQL Database, that's a good one. And then the IoT one was one where we've taken this large-scale scenario we've deployed with several customers, templatized it, and released it so that you can develop with your own IoT scenarios. A couple other big ones here was the GA for Azure SQL auditing. So this makes it so that you can log your audit logs to log analytics, event hubs, and you can also log Microsoft operations. So if you have a support ticket with Microsoft and we have to go in and do something, you can now audit what's done there. I think those are some of the big ones, but again, we'll share some references if you want to go deeper into any of these. The continuation of Azure SQL Database is for two tiers, and that's the hyperscale tier and the serverless tier. Again, if you're not super familiar with the hyperscale tier, essentially we re-architected SQL Server to be a cloud-native solution. We implemented a tiered architecture to be able to do this, to allow us to scale not only vertically, but also horizontally. So this is really interesting. It introduces the ability for us to kind of get rid of some things that used to be size of data operations, like backups, like scaling, and also is going to enable you to have a database that's up to 100 terabytes in size. And architecturally, there's nothing stopping you from going further than that. Now, like I mentioned, we re-architected this from the ground up, essentially. So there are some things we're working on to bring parity to Azure SQL Database other tiers, so like the general purpose or the business critical tiers. And so you'll see a couple examples of this here, like TDE with bring your own key support, geo-replication, storage redundancy options, database copy, and actually we just announced, I think it was yesterday, support for failover groups for hyperscale. So you'll see us bringing those in because in many ways we see hyperscale as the future of Azure SQL Database in the cloud. Then the other service tier I want to touch on is serverless. And this is available in Azure SQL Database in the general purpose service tier. And this is essentially going to allow you to set a minimum and a maximum number of vCores, and we will auto scale you on a per second basis of what you actually need and charge you accordingly. So auto scaling is a big thing here. And the other big win for serverless is that if you want, you can turn on auto pause delay. So you can set a delay time of, for example, 1 hour, and after no connections to that database, will actually separate the compute from storage and only charge you for the storage. So I explain all this just in case you haven't worked with serverless. We're seeing huge adoption here. And again, there's just a few things we're bringing into the picture. This is largely has all the parity with Azure SQL Database, but we are bringing in zone redundancy in preview, which is something that was available for the general purpose and business critical tiers. And that essentially just gives you one more layer of redundancy within a region. And again, we can share some more info to learn more. One of these new things in Azure SQL Database that I find really interesting, I wanted to touch on, is named replicas. So this is something that's not available anywhere else in Azure SQL DB or Azure SQL Managed Instance. But this allows you to get really large read scale. So you can essentially create these named replicas, up to 30 of them. So you give them a name. They can be in a different server. They don't have to be the same number of vCores. So for example, if you were to create a geo replica, the advice is that, hey, this should be the same if you have an 80 vCore database, this should be an 80 vCore replica. But these named replicas don't have that requirement. So you can spin these up when you need them and kind of, we say, read scale on the fly. I can essentially deploy an 80 vCore named replicas for a 15 terabyte database in about 2 minutes. And then when I'm done with it, maybe I'm doing it for reporting or analytics, I can just delete it. So we're seeing a lot of adoption here. 30 replicas is a ton. So if you have these read heavy workloads, this is great because you don't have to do any data movement in order to do this, and the data is always in sync. There's a GitHub and YouTube recording if you want to see more. We've also done some stuff on Data Exposed. So this is going to be great for both OLTP, but also for those HTAP type of workloads. All right, the final thing that I want to cover before we get into security is what's new across Azure SQL. Now, Bob talked about Microsoft Defender for SQL. This started as an Azure SQL platform as a service thing only. Bob mentioned how we brought this into SQL VM, and we've also been bringing it to even things like in Azure Arc and SQL Server itself. And then finally, Azure Monitor SQL Insights is this new thing we announced kind of mid last year that allows you to monitor all your Azure SQL resources in one place using the power of Azure Monitor. If you haven't seen this, this is definitely something worth checking out. Gives you more insights and allows you to see a lot of things that used to not be able to see so easily from the Azure portal. So I think that's all the updates I had, and we can dive, Bob, if you want a little into security.
Sure, thanks, Anna. You can kind of see a lot of the investments we're making, as Anna just talked about, is to make sure that hyperscale and serverless are first class, right? They're different technologies to run databases in the cloud, but we want all the fundamental things that we do to make sure they're supported for those technologies. Just like what we talked about for managed instances, security is a big deal for us, and our investments show it. So here's a couple of things that we announced to think about in terms of security. Number one, just like I talked about for MI, we want passwordless access. So this Azure AD auth only scenario, again, it's like getting rid of mixed mode from SQL Server. We now support that with GA for Azure SQL Database. Always encrypted is a technology that we've invested in, end-to-end encryption. We've had that around for a few releases in Azure SQL and in SQL Server, but now in GA is secure enclaves. This is really significant because of the fact that the VM team has VMs that support enclave hardware technology at the chip level, right? We can now support enclaves and attestation services within Azure together. And so Anna and I even found this is not just great for supporting rich queries or making this a more seamless, a more secure experience, but there's even performance differences here for always encrypted when enclaves are supported. So with Azure SQL Database now, you get the secure enclave concept, that enclave being down at the hardware level within how we're hosting the database. And then Anna touched on the fact that we're doing Azure SQL Database Ledger. We announced that for public preview way back in build in May of 2021. We also announced that in private preview for SQL Server 2022. And just to give you an idea of how significant this might be for you, just consider this. You may have seen me, Bob Ward, talk in the past about the knowledge of SQL Server internals. And you may be like, hey, man, if I gave Bob access to my system as a DBA, or I had somebody else like that, could they go rogue here? Could they go in and literally go in and make changes to the database at like the page level and fake out and not catch somebody making changes that could be normally audited? Well, Ledger is the reason why it's called tamper evident. Reasons why we talk about blockchain is we use a series of blocks as system table hashes within the database to audit what's going on. But the other key piece to the puzzle is, and Buck, Woody, and I did a really fun demo in December at an event in Vegas on this, and I actually really tried this, is that even if I try to go in and hack those system tables that have these blockchains, there's a separate storage, a trusted storage as a hash of a hash, like a checksum. So if I didn't even know that existed, there's always going to be this evidence that somebody tried to tamper down through the system within SQL Server. Very exciting technology. We're starting to see some pretty cool customer case usage out of this. Another area you might have heard about an announcement that was something called Purview. which is a separate Azure service for governance and centralized control. And so one of the things they've announced already is the ability to do things like scanning and classification of your data across several different data sources, including Azure SQL and SQL Server. That's also going to do something called lineage. Get ready for that one. You're going to start to see some demos on that coming up. This lineage idea is super cool, allowing you to dependency maps across things like where my stored procedures exist across different reports and access and things of that nature. So think of Purview as being one aspect of being a data classification, lineage system, data mapping system. The other thing we announced, though, both for Azure SQL Database and for SQL Server, is this idea of centralized access control. And so the one thing that makes sense to kind of show you is more of a visualization of what does that actually really look like, and an example. And if you've ever seen Anna and I present before, we always pick on each other, right? So I'll pick on Anna. Let's just say that I want to set up a new group of people to do performance monitoring for my SQL assets across Azure SQL, Managed Instance, Database, SQL and VM, SQL Server, everything. Now, I really like Anna, but I don't want to give her full sysadmin rights to do this. And think about performance monitoring, having things like access to key DMVs to go look at performance information. Now, if I wanted to set up roles for this myself, I could do it with SQL Server, I could do it with Azure SQL, but it's a lot of maintenance for me to do this. What if with Purview, we had a built-in role called a performance monitor role that's knowledgeable about how SQL works, so it handles things like what are the key DMVs to give Anna access to do this role. And then what I'll do is I'll go into Purview and I'll publish a policy that gives Anna rights to do this. And I don't even have to go directly to these assets. Purview will publish a policy directly within Azure SQL, SQL Server, whatever it needs to do, give her the right access without me even touching directly these SQL assets. And then if I don't trust Anna anymore to do this job, I can take her away from the role in Purview, republish the policy, and now she's not granted access anymore. So this is why we think of it as centralized, granular access to Azure SQL Database or to SQL Server at scale. I'm pretty excited to see how this technology will land for a lot of customers, especially when you need to manage some of these new types of things across a lot of different assets. And for customers they're going hybrid now, they got SQL servers, they've got Azure SQL databases, managed instances, SQL and VM, they got them everywhere. And they want things like this to do centralized, not just data mapping and cataloging, but centralized access control.
Awesome. And we did get one question. Mohammed, it's a great question. I love this question. It says, is there a dev environment to check these features apart from MSDN subscription or the one-time new account setup or a more generous credit? Now, a couple things here to check into. Depending on your company, you might have some subscription available or some free through Visual Studio, I think, subscription available. Microsoft Learn is the right place to go. So for example, Bob and I, shameless plug here, back in 2020, created something called Azure SQL Fundamentals, and I can throw that link in the chat too. But essentially what we were trying to do is give people a place to get hands-on and learn the differences between SQL Server and Azure SQL. Now, the great thing about this is if you go in there and you go to any of the exercises, I think I might actually have one open, you're going to be able to get access to a free sandbox. So this sandbox is 4 hours long. I was spinning it up to test something earlier this morning. You get 20 a day. Sorry? Okay, I'm guessing that was just an accident. But what you're going to be able to do is actually deploy Azure SQL Database or other services and try these things out. Now, I will be candid and say we don't have this available for Managed Instance today, but you can find some for VM and Azure SQL Database that allow you to play around, and we can share some more resources here as well. That's kind of your best way to get playing for free. So hopefully that helps. Any other tips you have on that front, Bob?
No, I think people don't realize that if they just want Azure training for free, I don't think they know that option exists. And we've had a lot of customers start looking at that as a way to go dive into Azure without spending any money.
Exactly. Cool. Hopefully that helps, Mohammed. All right. So migrations. So in the migration space, we have been doing a lot this year, whether it's for homogeneous or heterogeneous migration. So the difference between those is one is coming from SQL Server and just trying to go either to SQL Server in a virtual machine, Azure SQL Managed Instance, or Azure SQL Database. And then heterogeneous is when we say you're going from something else to SQL, for example, from Oracle to Azure SQL. In public preview early in the year, we announced the ability to migrate and assess at scale from VMware with Azure Migrate. This has been greatly adopted for our VMware customers. Makes it really easy to see at a large scale what you could be migrating to, any blockers you might have, some cost recommendations. We also announced in public preview more recently an extension in Azure Data Studio that you can do all of these things right from Azure Data Studio and migrate either to VM or Azure SQL Managed Instance. And we also have an extension to connect to Oracle and convert your Oracle data objects to Azure SQL objects from Azure Data Studio as well. Now, in the tool space, you can see on the right, there are a lot of tools that talk about the different ways we're helping with things like conversion, if you're converting from, again, a heterogeneous like Oracle, DB2, etc. And then also some tools like the Data Access Migration Toolkit or Database Migration Assistant. One interesting thing here is we worked with our data science team to add some new models that will actually help in recommending what service tier, what number of vCores, etc. that you should use. So this is really interesting. We also worked on improving the UI. Migration is super important to us. The final thing I'll mention is this link aka.ms/data migration. The value here is that we're able to essentially, you say what you're coming from and where you want to go. So maybe you're coming from Microsoft Access, you want to go to Azure SQL DB, and there's a custom guide for that. And there's a custom guide for pretty much every combination. So hopefully that's something that's helpful. There's one question from Prashant. Maybe this is one, Bob, you might have insight on. It says, is it DMA where we can use to overwrite the database when we do a migration? I'm not familiar with that is possible, but Bob, do you have insights?
I'm not sure either, but to be candid with you, I don't any longer use DMA for actual migration. You can be done technically still, but what we're really kind of steering customers to do is to use Azure Data Studio. The Azure Data Studio extensions that we have, this is specifically for SQL Server migrations. For SQL Server migrations, Azure Data Studio supports a really cool extension to do even online migrations to both VM and MI. I'm pretty sure in those scenarios, it's not an overwrite even allowed then. It's migrating a new database when you're migrating over. But I don't know specifically where DMA even supports that, but I wouldn't use DMA either way. That's really not the direction for that tool. It's more about the recommendations piece.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a good point to call out. Hopefully that helps, Prashant. All right. Moving on from migration, let's touch briefly on Azure Arc enabled services. Just wanted to highlight that Azure Arc exists. So this is how we're saying, hey, if any hardware that you can run Kubernetes, we're going to support getting these platform as a service like services like Azure Arc enabled SQL Managed Instance and Azure Arc enabled PostgreSQL Hyperscale. And there's a lot going on in this space, a lot of updates. Let me just put those up. I know we had a question earlier. Bob, was that a question you had insights on? It says, are there plans to have SQL Server Operator for Kubernetes?
Okay, that's a great question. So that would be independent of this discussion here with Azure Arc. But I will tell you that we are actively working with Red Hat on a operator that they may build for us and work together on that could be used for SQL Server for OpenShift, specific to OpenShift. But I do know from talking to our team that is something in the works right now.
Got it. Cool. Hopefully that that helps. Sorry. Okay. Just for time, I think actually, Bob, you did a whole presentation on SQL Server 2022, but I'd love to get your take on what are kind of the big ticket items for SQL Server 2022.
Sure. And the only way to do that, Anna, is bring up the wheel of power. The wheel of power. You know, Anna laughs at me because I credit these funny names, right? So just real briefly, when I did SQL 19, I had like this quadrant of features. This is my wheel of power. So in SQL 2022, if you go back and look at that presentation in December, it was all about these 5 big areas. Connecting SQL to the cloud in new and exciting ways for disaster recovery, Synapse Link, Purview integration. If you look to the right over here in this wheel, all about getting faster with no code changes. Parameter sniffing, it will be solved. How about saving the world from parameter sniffing? We'll do that in SQL 2022 by default, no code changes. We'll invest in things like Ledger. We talked about Ledger. We'll invest in security, scalability, availability, that meat and potatoes. You'll always see us do investments there with a lot of cool stuff that we're working on in space. Extending Polybase to do things like S3, access to S3 storage with Parquet files, or how about backup restore to S3 storage? That's a cool scenario. If you're thinking about migrating from Amazon RDS with SQL Server, which uses S3 storage, you can now do a native backup restore from that S3 storage into SQL Server. And then you look to the left over here in the final piece of the wheel is we're going to keep T-SQL alive. T-SQL is a great option for customers. And so we want to make sure you don't have to learn a new language to do things like JSON, time series, shore up T-SQL functions for string processing, things customers have been asking us for. So at the highest level, this is what we're doing, Anna. And I'll just tell you real quickly that the biggest thing people have gotten excited about, especially these top 2 areas to the right, connecting to the cloud, things like Synapse Link, or solving parameter sniffing or degree of parallelism problems, things of that nature, all with no code changes. So, or how about query store on read replicas finally, right? Things of that nature customers have been asking us for a very long period of time. And I think the best way to end it today is just talk about what are we doing for the future. And you and I work across our entire team, so we see this live, guys. This isn't just making up a marketing slide. We see this every day talking to our customers, to our group, our engineering team, and our leaders. And that is, wherever Azure SQL exists, we will always build the engine. The engine is the heart of what we do, and we'll do it in these 3 areas: security, performance, availability, which is why you see all of that across everything we talked about today. And we want SQL Server 2022 and Azure Arc to become a new normal for you to connect to the cloud when you're ready. Not have to do it, but when you're ready, connect on-premises assets to the cloud per your terms and per your needs. And we talk about Azure SQL Database. We really feel you're going to see us double down on the developer experience. Think things like hyperscale and serverless will become just normal things we think everybody will think of, especially these cloud-born apps with Azure SQL Database. And then look what we're doing in the MI space. We showed you a whole lot of things we're doing. So we think that if you're in SQL Server today and you want to move to the cloud, your best destination, even though you could go to VM, it's a great experience, and we're continuing to innovate there, but we think your best destination is going to be with Azure SQL Managed Instance. And then because we know you're thinking about migrating, not everything, but some, we want to make it seamless, predictable, but notice these other 2 points. We want to try to give you business information and cost insight information to help make those decisions at scale. And then we've seen this firsthand. When we talk to our team about innovation on anything you're seeing here, it should be built in. These are like principles we're trying to adhere to, right? It should be built in, it should be intelligent. It's got to be secure, and it's got to be scalable. And then we need to give you the best experiences that we can. Our tools and things that we build, the portal, things of those natures need to have the best experiences that are intuitive and then make things a lot easier for your lives. So if I think about what we're doing in 2022 and beyond, this slide here represents a great aspect of everything we do in our team.
Awesome. Yeah. And if you watch this session and we're like, wow, there are so many updates, how could I possibly stay up to date on everything that's happening? Have some good news for you, hopefully. Every month, I release a blog at this URL, aka.ms/news update, and that's going to contain all the updates from the previous month. So all the blogs, all the product updates across the Azure SQL family, and we're even exploring across all of our databases. So if you want to know the latest on Cosmos DB or Postgres on Azure, this is going to be your one-stop shop to get all those news updates. We also stream that as an episode, and we bring in special guests. For example, when we launched SQL Server 2022, we brought in Bob to tell us all about it. And we do that live monthly. It's usually the first or second Wednesday of the month at 9 a.m. Pacific, and you can see it on our YouTube channel. Someone mentioned earlier about the news show. So in addition to this 1 hour live episode, we do release shorter episodes with members of our product group, whether it's engineers, program managers, even people from other organizations working on things related to Azure SQL, and other things like Synapse and migrations. We have a whole series on migrating to SQL. And we also have MVP episodes. We have members of the community come on to our show once a month on Tuesdays to do an episode as well. So this is a great way to stay up to date and kind of get deep information as well as get how-tos and learn about new capabilities. I also wanted to mention Microsoft Learn. So someone had mentioned, how do I get hands-on for free? These are a couple examples, and I know Bob also has just done one on Azure Arc. Bob, maybe if you want to put that in the chat, if you know the short URL. Should have put that in here. And then you can also go to aka.ms/SQL workshops to find a lot of open source presentations and other workshops hosted on GitHub for your learning. And I think the final thing here is if you follow us on Twitter, any of these accounts, really, you'll be able to stay up to date on all the releases and events that are going on. We actually have the Data Exposed Live News update for December is happening tomorrow at the same time. So if you want more updates and you can handle some more, then you can tune in tomorrow, and you can always catch them later on our YouTube channel. And Bob put in the chat the Azure Arc course. So if you're interested in going deeper in that space, that's a great course that was done by Bob and Buck, two of the biggest experts, if not the biggest experts on Azure Arc data services. So a great place to learn. I think we're at time, but if folks have any questions, I'm happy to stick around, and thank you guys so much. Any other thoughts before we close, Bob?
No, was a great year in 2021. We covered a ton of stuff. You can tell we're pretty serious about this across everything we're doing. This isn't just an investment in one space. And I hope what you got an idea of was it's not just cloud only, guys. It's cloud first. SQL Server's alive and well. Azure Arc's alive and well. But we're serious about doing this stuff across every one of these assets and then honing that experience on where it makes sense.
Perfect. Thank you both, Anna and Bob. It's always good to kind of see how things are progressing and all the work put into it. I might be a little bit biased, but I quite like the name of the Azure SQL Fundamentals course as well. I think it kind of rings true with this one. But thank you all. I know you said you feel free to hang around. I am available as well, so if you want to stay on, any questions, that's of course an option. But if anyone has to head off, I know people are busy schedules. We will try and get this recording up as soon as we can. So thank you all again.
Thanks, everybody.